Hello and welcome. I can see people are joining, so we'll just wait to see the numbers go up and then we will kick off. So we're moving along quite quickly. Okay, I think I'll start. So hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today for our ESN Annual Marketplace session, Building Flexibility Markets for a Net Zero Electricity System. For those of you who don't know, the ESN, the Electricity Storage Network, are the voice of the UK electricity storage sector run by Regen. My name is Richard Palmer, Senior Consultant at Road Knight Taylor, and we at Road Knight Taylor are very pleased to be one of the sponsors of this event. We are an independent power and energy consultancy providing advice to UK businesses and organisations, and we're involved in both front of the meter and behind the meter energy investments. We have phenomenal in-house grid expertise working for both landowners and developers. And in 2020, for example, we secured over 2 gigawatts of capacity for solar and storage, over 1 gigawatt of third-party connection offers assessed, and millions saved from connection offer non-contestable costs. And you'll be able to see Catherine Cleary, one of our grid experts, speak tomorrow at 4 p.m. talking about distributed networks of the future. So tune in for that. Catherine is brilliant. Now for some housekeeping. For this series, we have moved to a new platform, Hoover, which provides you with increased interaction with other delegates, the speakers and sponsors. If you haven't done so already, we would recommend downloading the Hoover app to allow access to further facilities. At lunchtime each day, we will be organising a networking session to allow you to meet other delegates and build your network. There are also opportunities to participate in the community board and request one-to-one meetings with other delegates. Some of you will have decided to watch this session in Hoover, and some will be watching this in the Zoom platform. Your question can be sent using the Q&A function in either platforms. For Hoover, this is on the right-hand side, and for those of you in Zoom, this is a button at the bottom. Don't worry, your questions will be passed to me regardless of which platform you're on. Hopefully I'll see them all. Due to time constraints, unfortunately, we will not be taking questions through the raise your hand function. If you would like to talk with other delegates during the session or comment what's being said, you can use the chat function. For those in Hoover, this is found on the right-hand side of your screen. For those in Zoom, this is at the bottom. Do introduce yourself in the chat function, tell jokes, and let people know where you are joining from today. So thankfully, that's the housekeeping over. That's probably the hardest bit for me to get through. So now we can get on to the main event. We know flexibility is essential for a net zero system, but while some low carbon technologies have started to make inroads into flexibility markets, they are dominated by incumbent fossil fuel generation. If we are to transition to a net zero grid, our flexibility services also need to be net zero carbon. The government and the system operator are now starting a serious conversation about what electricity markets look like in a net zero system and how they incentivise zero marginal cost technologies and flexibility. Madeline Greenhalgh, Policy and Advocacy Manager of the ESN, will dive into Regen and ESN's thoughts on the need to explicitly value and recognise carbon in our flexibility markets. I sit on the Electricity Markets and Revenue Steering Group with Madeline, and I know she works incredibly hard on a number of different fronts for the ESN, but she loves policy, and there's a lot of policy, and she really helps me certainly to try and put the jigsaw pieces together. So Madeline will now talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will ask some questions and try and incorporate the questions from the floor if I can multitask. Over to you, Madeline.
Great, thanks, Richard. I do love policy. I'm a big policy fan. Right, I'm glad that comes across. Hopefully it will come across in this session today as well. So yeah, great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the intro. Thanks everyone for joining today. As Richard said, I'm going to be talking for about 10 to 15 minutes, just talking through a paper that Regen ESN put together last year on this very topic. So the paper is looking at how flexibility markets are evolving, as Richard said, and how they might need to adapt for a net zero electricity system. And this paper was really based on a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the last year or so. We know that a lot of our members are really keen to see change in this area. We've seen the industry start to talk about it a lot more, so the conversations are really stepping up. We're really pleased to see that BEIS have actually picked this up, so they've recognised that this is a really big industry subject. They've started to run workshops on this, and they've been developing their thinking over the last summer, and we're really pleased to see with what they're coming up with. And part of this paper was to give them some ideas as well and really spark some debate for that work that they're doing. So we're really looking forward to seeing what comes next from them, hopefully within the next few months maybe. Yeah, so before I just start my presentation, I will caveat it by saying that I don't have all the answers to this. Regen, ESN, we don't have all the answers. This is a really difficult, complex topic. Not everyone's going to agree with what we're saying. Some of it's a bit controversial, but it's meant to get you talking. It's meant to get the industry talking. So please do spark some debate from in the chat and come back to us afterwards with some Q&A as to how you feel about the presentation that I'm going to give today. So Hannah, if you could just go on to the next slide. So I'm going to be a bit Chris Whitty today, moving the slides on. Yeah, this slide is maybe a little bit back to basics for some of you, probably a little bit motherhood and apple pie for those of you who know what flexibility is and are very familiar. But I think it's worth just revisiting, just so we can build up the case for net zero flexibility markets, revisiting what flexibility actually is. So I would say traditionally it comes from fossil fuel sources, so gas peakers, diesel gensets. These are easy to turn on, they respond quickly to shifts in demand, and they're easily controllable. I would say they're generally quite expensive as they're not being used at other times, so they're used for one purpose really, and that means they're often quite expensive to run. What do we have now? Well, we've got a lot more low carbon sources available. So we've got storage, flexible demand, interconnection, although on that latter one, I will say it's a little bit murky as to whether they're low carbon or not. I'll probably come into the transparency point that I'm going to talk through later on. And what do we have? What do we see in the future? Well, it's quite interesting that we need more flexibility because of the more variable renewables in the system. But actually, those variable renewables can provide some of that flexibility as well. So it's still quite new, but there are studies going on at the moment. I saw a study a while ago about how, for example, solar PV could provide sort of synthetic spinning reserve and frequency response. So it's definitely an option for those renewables to help balance the system as well as generate in a low carbon way as well. So just moving on to the next slide. I wanted to go through a bit about how that flexibility is valued and incentivized and what the current market structure is around that. I've put some on the slide here. This just covers a few different markets that value flexibility, but there are more, there are quite a few. So National Grid Electricity System Operator, the ESO, they run loads of different markets as the above to incentivize those flexible assets to provide response, reserve and other services to the system. So they do that at a national level to provide national balancing. At the local level, so just that one at the bottom there, local flexibility markets, so distribution network operators, as they become more of a system operator to balance the system at a local level, they're also introducing local flexibility markets as well. So all of these markets kind of are based around one concept of technology neutrality, really. Everyone's starting from a level playing field. So the auctions are administered by the ESO, by DNOs, and they are set really with a set of technical requirements. So do you meet the technical requirements for that service? And then after that, they're really almost solely decided on a price basis. So it's quite a narrow window. You're looking at technical requirements and lowest cost. But in reality, as anyone who has an asset will know, there's a much wider range of external factors that affect which of those technologies win contracts. So it's not just about technology and price here. There are lots of other factors, and we'll go into some of those in a minute as well. So next slide, Hannah. So why do we need to change? Well, we're all here today, so I don't need to tell you why we need to change to net zero to address the climate emergency. I think that is hopefully well cemented in your minds. But why do we need to change flexibility? What's the problem here? Well, I would say whilst, as I referred to at the beginning, there's an increase in low carbon sources of flexibility, so storage, demand side response, particularly in the UK, but they've actually often struggled to compete with those incumbent fossil fuel generators across a number of different markets. So The reasons for this are many. The merit order dispatch in the control room, which we'll be talking to the ESO about tomorrow. There's barriers for smaller participants and an inability to compete on cost as well. So lots of different factors affecting their ability to compete there. So I wanted to have a look a little bit at how that manifests itself in different markets. So I picked a couple of markets to look at. On this side, you can see this is about the capacity market. So capacity market providing security of supply for the UK system. So the capacity market does allow low carbon technologies, but it has really low D-rated value. So I won't try to explain D-rating, but essentially a calculation to understand how much value you would give to a certain technology. So as you can see from this, solar gets 3% D-rating, which is really low. A bit higher for storage when it's they get 40% if it's longer duration, or 20%, which is higher. But if you compare that to the open cycle gas turbine, 95% D-rating, you can see what difference that makes in the money that they're earning. So £15 for the 95% D-rated per megawatt compared to 50p per megawatt for that solar. So you can see what a massive difference this makes in terms of cost. And anyone who's engaged with the capacity market in the past will know there's a huge admin burden. It's an incredibly complex market to be a part of. So really, if you're a small player, you've got one of these lower D-rated assets, then applying for contracts, the admin burden of doing that really negates any value that you get from this market. And then the next slide, we are looking at the local angle of this. So this is another market that's worth exploring. So I mentioned that DNOs are looking at that local balancing market, and they've been doing this for a couple of years now. And the aim of the rhetoric around these markets is to facilitate net zero by reducing the cost of network constraints and providing a route for a wider range of customers, lots of smaller renewable assets, low carbon assets. The markets right now, I would say, are pretty low value, they're short term, and they often favour distributed energy resources with a spare capacity, and those tend to be gas or diesel. So what does that actually look like? Who's winning the contracts? Well, it's a little bit difficult to tell, and I'll come to that in a minute, but this chart is from Piclo. So Piclo is the platform that all DNOs use to host these flexibility tenders, and they can analyse what's applying for these tenders. So this chart is showing that 70% of the technologies registered on this platform are generators, which would be great, but we don't think they are renewable. So Piclo state that they think they're most likely to be powered by gas or diesel. So if we're saying these markets are aiming to facilitate net zero, they're not doing a great job right now because they're mostly run by high carbon assets. So if we just look at the next slide, so coming back to that issue of transparency, how do we actually tell who's winning these contracts? It can be quite difficult. I think the two examples that I've show there's quite a range of transparency levels. So the capacity market is pretty transparent. You can download the data. The balancing mechanism is really transparent. There's tons of data for people to explore. When you look at things like local flex markets, they're a bit more difficult to assess. If you look at some of the ancillary services that we talked about at the beginning, like the new inertia market, for example, it's very, very difficult. When the results of the new inertia market came out last year, I found it next to impossible to understand what technologies have won those contracts. And that's just not very helpful for us to be able to understand if these services are low or high carbon. So we need to understand who's winning the contracts. We need to understand the carbon intensity of the markets as they run. But I think it's important here to distinguish between indirect and direct emissions. So the direct emissions of a market as it's running, but also the indirect emissions of the market that funding is causing. So some markets operate much less frequently. For example, the capacity market, which we've already talked about, it's for security of supply. So it's actually never run. If it does run, it will be very, very infrequent. So understanding how the carbon intensity of that market as it runs isn't very helpful. So we need to be able to understand how much that market is actually propping up the fossil fuel business case. How much is it ensuring that gas and diesel plants can carry on emitting? So a number of quite difficult things for us to be able to understand from the data that's available. This slide just shows a few ideas of how that might happen. Again, we'll need to think this through much more carefully, but just a few ideas. So at the very high level, the DNOs and the ESOs, they're all companies. They have to report on scope 3 emissions as part of their official reporting. So they could tell us what they're procuring and the carbon emissions of that. That would be quite high level though, so we might need some more information. So the second option here, as I was saying, release the data from the auctions, which should have the technology that's won the contract and the carbon intensity of it as well. But that would only tell us the carbon intensity of the generation as the market runs. So number 3, providing a bit more detail. So some specific reporting on the carbon intensity of each of those markets done regularly. Now, with all 3 of these, that's going to give us loads of information, but I think part of this is on the industry to analyse that, come back and use that to be able to push and say, well, we think this isn't working, or we think this is working. So we need that information if we're going to be able to say what's right and what's not. So in a perfect world, we've got all that information, the data's coming out from the ESO and from the DNOs. So once we know how high carbon a market is, how do we then understand how to value the carbon in that market? Well, the favoured approach of this, if you ask any economist, would be the carbon price. Often lots of economists sitting around a table, one carbon price to rule them all, and which I've tried to represent in my lovely clip art slide here, very, very tech savvy. It always reminds me of Lord of the Rings and one ring to rule them all. Very much an economist sort of mindset, very focused there. But aside from that criticism, it is a really good economic concept. It ensures the polluter pays, that the value of carbon is correctly levied against a fossil fuel asset, and that eventually forces that asset off the system through the market forces. So as we've seen happening with coal. But there are quite a lot of criticisms of the carbon price, and I don't think that it's the right solution here for many reasons. I mean, for a start, it's not high enough right now to actually meet our carbon targets. It's an incredibly international, tricky diplomatic negotiation matter, which will be decided at COP26. And also, it's a bit uncertain how that would actually work for the volatile nature of flexibility revenues that are really searching those really peaky prices. Does a standard set carbon price really work to incentivise those assets? So I would say that carbon pricing is often put forward as a solution, but if we rely on that as a mechanism to incentivise this shift away from fossil fuels, is that quick enough? Is it urgent enough? Or are there other mechanisms needed? Well, what are those mechanisms, I hear you ask? On the next slide, I'll take you through some of those. So there's a number of options that we could look at. And these are not all the right options. These are just some ideas, the things that have been put forward in literature. I think they're worth considering, but no, this isn't the answer to everything. We'll need to explore these in more detail. So I'll just go through some of these quite quickly. So an emissions limit, so we have that in the capacity market now. So putting an emissions limit on things that can participate in various different markets. Could we use the same concept in the capacity market in other markets as well? Options 2 and 3 are both taken from Dieter Helm's Cost of Energy review, the huge tome, if anyone's had a chance to read it over the last few years. So this is set around our auction process. So we could have a 2-stage auction. So you could set a carbon target for your auction. And if you meet that in the first round, then great. If you don't, you rerun the auction several times. So it might be 2-stage, it might be multiple stage until you meet that carbon target. And number 3 is a variation on that. Could you put different criteria into the auction? So you already have some criteria for what you need to win a particular contract, but could you score that and put multiple criteria in that? So one of those criteria could be carbon, but there could be others as well. For example, what's the social value of an asset that's participating in that market? And then we look to the 4th one, so D-rating. Again, something we already use. The D-rating is calculated using a very specific methodology that the National Grid ESO calculates. But what would it mean if carbon was part of that calculation? That could be something we could look to do. Option 5, looking over to the states. So Massachusetts has a clean peak standard, and that's using the specific price periods, and it rewards specific peak periods of demand, and it rewards renewables, storage, DSR, any low carbon technologies that are outputting or turning down during those particular peak periods. And then finally, option number 6, this is from the Energy Systems Catapult. So this is looking at a carbon intensity standard that would put a minimum standard on consumers, generators, suppliers to meet that standard. And then credits could be traded within that. So it's quite a similar system to the carbon pricing concept, but it's quite specific to the energy sector. So like I say, some of those will be right, some of them won't be, but I think it's important that we put some of those ideas out there and think about how we could integrate those into our current market system. So just to finish, I think come back to what does this mean for storage? Well, storage, as I mentioned before, it often struggles to compete with those big incumbents. And I think part of that is their inherent value isn't actually recognised in the markets. What's their inherent value? Well, they're low carbon. Why would we not recognise it in those markets? And if we do that, that's going to help us to get closer to net zero. And Kathy and Marek both mentioned a target we want to meet for flexibility. If we want to meet that target in the next decade or so, we need to recognise that inherent value, and valuing that in a market in itself, I think it is really key to helping us get there. So I'll stop there, Richard. I've gone on for long enough, and I'll let you take over with a few questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Madeline. Well, it's a great paper and great presentation. I know you have a position paper on what you've just presented there. How have you got on getting your message out to the policy and players in the market, such as BEIS, Ofgem, the DNOs and National Grid? Are they listening and taking on board?
I think they are to an extent. So I've been really pleased with how BEIS has listened to this, actually. If anyone from BEIS is on the call, kudos to you, you've done really well. They ran some excellent workshops last year, which many of you might have participated in, some really tricky industry debate that was managed really well. And they've taken that on board and taken forward their work over the summer to really reflect what the industry had been saying. So hoping to see some of the outcomes of that. I think the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan is quite an obvious route for that. So I would hope that we'd see some action there. In terms of the ESO, this is something that we badger them about quite a lot. So we have regular meetings with ESN members and the ESO, so every few months, and this is something that comes up every time. You know, we're talking specifically about markets and how those markets run. How carbon is valued in those is something that the ESO constantly pushed on, and they are responding well. They're coming up with various different options. I think there's always more to do. It's not going to be an easy task for them. So I think it's for me, what more they could do would be to try and help us to understand what their difficulties will be, and then we as an industry can help them try to overcome those difficulties.
And on that point, with the various conversations with the ESO, Ofgem have just announced a review or proposal to create an independent body to run the electricity system, away from National Grid. That potentially sounds like a positive move to me, with everything that's coming forward, particularly with a target to run a zero carbon electricity system by 2025. Given your constant dialogue and discussions with the ESO, what are the benefits of that proposal? Do you think that's a positive thing?
I do. Just more generally, it's something that's been talked about for quite a long time. So I'm quite glad to see some kind of resolution to it, because we've known it's been on the cards for some time. So good that Ofgem finally put something out there, and we might actually see some moves to that. It was obviously mentioned in the energy white paper as well. I think there are multiple benefits to the ESO becoming more independent. There are different ramifications of that as well, which we'll need to think about carefully as an industry. So I could talk about that for ages, but it's really interesting. But I think for this specific issue, so the key thing for me, that being more independent from the private company that owns them, for National Grid, is their ability to set policy. I think often when we talk to the ESO, part of the issues that we have is that we want them to do something, but they're not able to. They come up against this wall of saying, well, policy isn't down to us. We're waiting for BEIS, we're waiting for Ofgem to tell us to do a particular thing. We can't make that decision because we're not in a position to do so. Becoming independent, well, I think there's a chance there to make them, to give them more of a policy remit. I mean, at the end of the day, they control the whole system. I think that it cannot be understated how important the role that ESO has in getting us to net zero. They know how the system works. They can control it on a day-to-day basis. They can control what generation, what flexible assets come on. They are so vital in that. Why not give them some policy leadership within that? I think, Richard, you and I have discussed about how, we've seen them do that really well. You mentioned the net zero 2025. That was a big watershed moment for the sector, I think, to say, well, oh wow, that's actually pretty soon, that's coming. They've set a really good target for the sector to aim for. I think it's really rallied everyone around. So and they know what they're doing. give them some of that policy direction. I think this can only help with that. And for this specific issue, it will help them. You know, if they're one of the things that they say about valuing carbon and flexibility markets is that that's not up to them. They have to be technology neutral, and I appreciate that. I think as I mentioned in my presentation, there's more we can do. We shouldn't. I think technology neutrality is a really iffy concept, to be quite honest, but that's what the DNOs, what's the ESO are mandated to do. They can't change that. Giving them more independence, giving them more policy roles, lets them assess whether they can change that, whether they could put carbon into that evaluation.
Great, and one step leading on, you know, BEIS recently launched a consultation enabling a high renewable net zero electricity system, which talks a lot about CFDs and co-location with flexible assets, which links on what you mentioned earlier about the smart systems and flexibility plan. My gut feel is that we need a more fundamental view of the current electricity market structure, given a future system without marginal cost of generation. You know, we've got this rapid transition in the UK electricity market outpacing governance regulation. Do you agree we need something fundamental? You know, often making that proposal for running systems separately. Do we need to go that much further, or are we seeing a lot of changes through general transition and markets pushing forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think this probably comes back to the very first point you made, Richard, about me. I love policy, so I really relish the idea of like a big change and getting my teeth into a big market change. Not everyone would agree with that. I think there's a few people in the industry who've been through, you know, EMR, massive electricity market reform changes over the years. They are painful, difficult to do. So I do appreciate that, but I think we're also. This isn't a gradual shift towards a slightly different way of working. This is a completely different way of running a system. And so we should recognise that. I think it's really important to recognise that things will change very drastically. And just saying that we'll adapt the current system as we go along is maybe just being quite narrow-minded and not seeing the bigger picture that things will change. Let's at least address that now. And I think this concept is part of that. So putting a value on something other than technology and price in a market is quite alien to a lot of people. And I can well imagine there's people sat listening to me on this call going, absolutely not, that's not how markets run. And I understand that. But I think if we are going to get to net zero, we really need to think more carefully about shifting that fundamental concept, and a fundamental change, I think, is the only way of doing that. So yeah, I think I really appreciate that BEIS have acknowledged that in their call for evidence. I would really recommend people on this call go and have a read, because it's really interesting, and I think it's a really good opportunity for us to start discussing that as a sector. And yeah, this putting the value on carbon in markets is one route to that fundamental market change.
I have a question here that's related to that structural point and mentioning Dieter Helm. Madeline, you didn't mention the really interesting Dieter Helm solution of all suppliers having a duty to provide firm power at all times. Should provide an elegant solution which, as Helm argues, would encourage innovative solutions, including to interseasonal storage.
Yeah, I think that's Ron that's asked that question.
Okay.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think firm power is something we definitely need to elaborate on more. So definitely something we should be looking into more. I think really interesting your final point there on interseasonal storage, and something that we've already discussed. We've only had 2 sessions today, and we've already discussed long duration interseasonal storage. What we have right now will not incentivize longer duration storage. So yeah, a firm power and assessing firm power will definitely be part of that. So yeah, completely agree with Ron. I would love to speak to Ron in more detail about his thoughts on that. It'd be very interesting to hear.
And that's another point, that the white paper specifically, the energy white paper specifically talks about longer duration batteries. And I know Anthony Price is waving a big flag for flow batteries and always at the front of moving energy storage to the next level. But wholesale markets, you know, currently only really support up to 2 hours of volatility. So how do we unlock the value? You know, we talk about the capacity market, you know, if they have longer duration batteries that perhaps could take more value there. Is there potential to push forward more for longer duration within the current market structure?
Yeah, there absolutely is. Again, Kathy touched on this in the leaders debate this morning. We should be looking at maybe a slightly different funding model to what we have right now. She talked about cap and floor that we have for interconnectors. Could that work for longer duration storage? I think, firm power, as Ron mentioned, is another route to that. I don't think that any of the existing markets we have right now will do that to the extent we need. I think it will if we're talking about, Marek said as well, long duration in inverted commas. What is long duration? If we talk about 4 hours, 6 hours, then yes, the markets we have right now will probably need some tweaking, but could get us there. If we're talking about days of storage, if we're talking about interseasonal storage, I personally don't think that the markets we have right now will incentivize that. We need to look at different funding models. Do we need like a RAB model, a regulated asset base model in the way that nuclear has and other massive infrastructure projects? Do we need to look at it in a different way in order to incentivize it? And I think that's another reason why a more fundamental market shift and review of markets is needed, not just looking what we have now.
Yeah, and on that, I agree. And on the Energy White Paper also supports the need to define storage and legislation when parliamentary time allows. Is this quite a fundamental to the building blocks for flexibility markets and valuing carbon? Could that really help if that was brought forward more quickly? Isn't that one of the cornerstones, along with other cornerstones, obviously?
Yeah, absolutely. I think until we know exactly what storage is and that we recognise that storage is something different, whether that's a subset of generation or whether it's its own thing, if it's not defined anywhere, then we're just treating it as it's just the exact same thing that generation does, and it does something very different, and it's also low carbon as well. So all of these things we need to recognise. Recognising that in legislation would be really helpful across the whole system, across the market system, across the planning system, across the business rate system, as you and I have talked about many times, which is it actually having a legal definition and properly putting our finger on what is storage and what does it do for the system that's different to generation and demand. And I think that would absolutely help us think that through.
And picking up on that point with business rates, do we need more joined up thinking across government and industry, BEIS, National Grid, climate change, the Treasury on developing models and plans? That's where one of the business rates issues come from, that really for behind the meter, which is a separate discussion to front to meter, that really can knock the economics and viability on its own for battery storage, solar behind the meter. And if that was more joined up, you might cut through some of these things, not only for carbon, but also for business rates, for example.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the point that many people are making, that net zero is not the responsibility of the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's partly their responsibility, but it's every single department's responsibility. Great that the Treasury are getting more involved in that. We'll see what happens with their net zero review. That's, I think, coming out in the next few months. But that sounds really basic, but joined up thinking, come on, this needs to be a common approach across all the different departments. Something just to give an example beyond kind of some of the ones we've already talked about is location as something we haven't discussed enough, I don't think. And there's plenty, because we have all those different people involved in incentivising various different bits of the electricity system, that it incentivises location in different ways. So business rates depends where you are in the country, your business rates will be different. Network charging depends where you are in the country and depends on your DNO, your charge will be different. Your connection costs will be different. And the different markets that you're a part of, whether that be the balancing mechanism, whether it's a constraint management pathfinder, voltage pathfinder, they also incentivise location differently. So how on earth, as a storage asset developer, would you know where to put your asset if you've got all these different things controlled by Ofgem, controlled by Grid, controlled by Treasury, controlled by BEIS? If they're not all thinking in the same way and joining that up, then how on earth are we going to incentivise locationally where assets need to go? So yeah, just as an example of better joined up thinking would be nice.
And taking from some of the structural points, but looking here and now, we're currently seeing another perfect storm in the electricity market. Low wind, cold temperatures, rising demand, interconnecting issues, Cullen Energy going to administration. the new dynamic containment product hitting the cap, which is primarily designed for battery storage. Anything I read from Aaron Lally is very positive for battery storage, a 4 to 6 year payback on a 10-year investment. And it was announced recently can operate, balancing market and operating the balancing market and free services market. So is the market here today for battery storage, large scale? Behind the meter, I think, a different discussion, but large scale, is it here now? We've got 1 gigawatt, there's a pipeline of 10 gigawatts. It's 2021, even with more structural things, flexibility is coming pretty fast. Do you think?
Yeah, I would say just if anyone does want an insight into how the market's run and where storage is going, follow Aaron Lally on LinkedIn, because I find his updates invaluable. He'll be quizzing Rob Rome tomorrow and part of our the National Control Centre debate. So yeah, I found his updates really interesting. So thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so I would love to be really positive, Richard, and say, yeah, in the next 5 years we'll get all that 10 gigawatts, deployed, and it will all be fine. I think part of my role as being the policy lead for the ESN is to be a bit more pragmatic about that. And yes, bang the drum for storage, absolutely, but I'm not sure that we are there. And without wanting to repeat myself too much, I genuinely don't think that without recognising that storage is a low carbon asset and putting a value on that, we won't get there. I think that's one of the other stuff is really important. There's lots of different things we need to do, but that will kind of evolve as the industry evolves, because we're still a relatively immature sector. We're still really new, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. We're sort of 5 to 6 years into this market. It's pretty slow, not slow, it's pretty new, I would say. We are moving quite fast, but it just take a while to get these things up and running. So there are lots of tweaks that need to be made. We'll need to iron out some of this stuff of how we actually participate in markets. But until we say, why is storage good? Because it can do all these lovely little great things to balance the system, but also because it's zero carbon. It's a part of getting to net zero. I think it baffles me a little bit is why we aren't jumping up and down and saying that should be much more inherently valued. And yet I don't think we'll see the success that we want for storage until that's the case.
And I agree, there's still a lot of uncertainty. Ancillary markets are quite thin, and you've got dynamic containment product there. I think it's the wholesale markets and volatility there that will give the longer term deeper liquidity and value. But yes, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. But anything you read from Aaron Lally, and someone said the question about Aaron Lally, that's Best Energy. So he's trading front of meter batteries. And how do you see the future, and this touched on a bit behind the meter, of national grid and DSO markets? Is the former for primary large scale flexible assets, the low hanging fruit hitting the bigger picture, and the latter primarily for smaller behind the meter assets? The DSO markets, I feel, maybe 2 or 3 years to go there, but where do you view that as part of the building blocks of flexibility you touched on in your presentation?
Yeah, I think it is really vital. I think balancing at a local level will become increasingly important. We've seen, without wanting to sort of repeat what other people say, we're moving to a decentralized system. We're going to have much more in the way of smaller assets. And we know that will be the case. There's debate between small and big storage, but we will have a lot more smaller storage and distributed assets, renewable assets as well. So we absolutely need those local flex markets to incentivise that. They will certainly be a part of that. A debate we've been thinking about quite carefully is the balance between that and infrastructure, and that balance is going to be quite tricky to make sure that it's correct. So our local flexibility market is actually just a short-term plug for DNOs until they are able to upgrade the network, or are they actually a longer-term solution? At the moment, I think they're probably seen as shorter term, and that's why they're not getting the value that they should have, or they could have. So I think it will remain to be seen. They need to develop quite significantly before they're really of any value to storage assets. We know how hard it is to make the stack that storage business case at the moment. You kind of just have to be quite lucky if you're in the right area and the DNO needs your asset to be flexible. But I also think we really need to understand a bit more about the local flex markets, how they're running, how those different areas are being decided. There's some DNOs that are great at being transparent about that and helping us understand, that others that are less good. So I think that point about transparency that I made earlier, how can we help DNOs assess, how can we assess more generally if local flex markets are the right thing if we don't know how they're running and what's winning contracts and what the future is for them.
And touching, we're coming close. I'll finish with a couple of questions. That we've coming through the carbon bit. That's you talked about the carbon pricing. You know, previously had the EU ETS and the UK carbon floor price. And one of the main concerns around the ETS was that the price is driven by speculators, not fundamentals. Should the UK's new carbon price strategy ensure that carbon is valued in all markets correctly? And I think you're arguing perhaps against that. Some argue that a carbon tax is a fairer, better solution. A trading scheme seems simpler and less prone to gaming. What do you think around that sort of carbon pricing, you know, flowing through?
Yeah. I think carbon tax is definitely probably my preferred route, but I'm not an economist, so as much as I'd like to be, I'm not. I don't have that expertise, but I definitely agree that a high enough carbon tax is absolutely the right way forward. I think Regen ESN signed a campaign last year, the Zero Carbon Commission, which is campaigning for that very thing. I definitely think it's necessary. I just don't think it's the only answer. I think it has its issues, and I think it's a longer term solution. Actually, in doing the research for this paper, I found quite a few things that were saying, well, actually, even if we get carbon prices up to the level we need, about sort of £70 a tonne, then that's still going to take ages, and that's still not going to be enough to get us to the targets we need. If the carbon prices as they are now are not going to, we won't meet our Paris targets if we stick to that. So they absolutely need to change. And I just think the diplomatic effort to get those to change is huge. You know, I think that's better now that we've got Joe Biden and not Trump. So COP26 negotiations will be led from a wholly different standpoint. So there's a chance that we'll get those negotiations across the line, but it's still, you're asking, this is a real international issue. You're asking the UK to put themselves on the line and raise the carbon price to a very high point in order to make this stuff happen. That makes us uncompetitive. And obviously that's a real issue right now with Brexit and everything like that. So I think it's a big ask. And even if that does happen, it will take several years for us to build up to that point. We can't just throw in a £70 price right now. We have to build up to that point. So I don't see it affecting the energy industry in the next few years. So why not put something in? I do think we need something now before maybe a carbon price or a carbon tax is effective.
Sure. And just a comment here, which might lead on to one of the other talks, Madeline. Can we be clear, low carbon and zero carbon must refer to the whole life cycle of the system? And I think that is picked up in one of another talk, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the concept of sustainability and I think it is the life cycle emissions of an asset are really important as well. So that's not something we talk about enough. Maybe it's something that we're interested in our sustainability working group, but it's very hard to get the right data on that. It's something we're struggling with a bit. I think it's interesting, Richard and I, we were having a conversation a while ago about when we're talking about these scored auctions, these multi-criteria auctions. Well, yeah. Okay, so carbon should be one of those values, but why not another type of emission or another issue of sustainability? Score that in that auction. I think whoever made that comment absolutely right, that we do need to think about other aspects, not just carbon. You know, we don't want to, as I often put it, we don't want to solve one environmental problem using particular technologies and just create another one else there by mining the whole world of lithium and cobalt and nickel, etc.
My final question, you know, what is your call to action? You know, what can we do with the audience listening? You know, what should BEIS Ofgem be doing? What's your, you know, killer point with what you're presenting here for us to take away?
So I think I'd like people to just at least have this debate. I think often it's kind of not talked about because it's almost a bit taboo. People don't want to mess with the market system. You know, it's sort of put on this pedestal. It's something we shouldn't mess with. So I'd really like people to take away from this conversation, create debate, talk about this. Let's actually have a conversation about it so we can at least come to kind of solution. I'd say ask for transparency. Like that's something we can do. That's not controversial. We should be asking ESO and DNOs to provide the data we need. So absolutely, please push for that. And I really think that hopefully we will get this, but I think BEIS need to come forward with the next step on what they're going to do with to develop this issue. How are they going to consider carbon and flexibility markets? I think they are, I hope they are, but I think the Smart Systems and Flex Plan, we should really be pushing for some kind of outcome and maybe a timeline of policy proposals of what might happen next.
Brilliant. Thank you, Madeline. And thank you for everyone who's joined us and listened to us. I just want to finish with a couple of points to highlight the ESN membership. The ESN is committed to create an environment which storage can flourish, ensuring that regulation and markets work for all types of technology. Through the ESN membership, we can build a thriving sector and help your business develop, and you can chat lots with Madeline and the Regen team. We've got other sessions coming up tomorrow on dynamic containment. Oh, here we go. Great Britain's Electricity National Control Centre, Storage Innovation Technology Showcase, and Catherine Cleary at that Smart Distributed Network of the Future debate. So we hope you can join us then for those various talks. And it just leaves me to say thank you again for joining. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.